Good evening and welcome to On the Record, a debate-style television talk show where Bahamians will find the balanced, true and open debate they've been looking for. There is much ado about doom and gloom relating to the current state of the Bahamian economy. The Minister of Finance says he met the proverbial cupboards bare and is having to borrow a whopping $720 million to pay the country's bills and sustain its workers. The opposition is insisting otherwise and is gawking at the amounts of monies to be borrowed. Politics aside, what is the country's economic future looking like? International credit rating agencies have cast a very negative forecast on our country's financial state. Can a new, fresh, partially inexperienced government handle all of this? Well, tonight we're going to discuss with experts charting a new way forward, the realities of the Bahamian economy, to see what course our country has been on. We will focus on unemployment, VAT, tourism, and the quality of life in general. Our guests will include Arinthia Kumalafe, Joseph Gaskins Jr. and Anthony Ferguson. It's all on the record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break.
On the Record is brought to you by Alive, the nation's newest and best LTE network.
Good to be alive.
This is us. We all live here. And while we don't think of ourselves as numbers, in the grand scheme of things, numbers are part of who we are. Like your phone number, for instance. That's why at Alive we believe you should keep your number when you switch. Go in store today and ask an Alive Switch Angel. They'll make it real simple for you. We are alive.
What are you doing?
Calling the bank to order more checks.
Go to epbahamas.com and order your checks from Executive Printers.
Executive Printers. We're the authority in business and personal check printing in the Bahamas. Come in and see one of our specialists or visit us online at epbahamas.com to design and order your checks today.
Now you can take the very best in entertainment with you with Cinemax Go. Log in to cinemaxgola.com and enjoy more than 300 hours of programming. Blockbuster movies and exclusive series at your pace, as many times as you want. And for free, enjoy Cinemax with your subscription television package. Wow. Cinemax Go. Cinema to go.
Rev, join the revolution.
Welcome back to On the Record. Tonight we explore the country's economic state and what can be done about it. Our guests for this evening's show are Arinthia Kumalafe, an attorney, a banker, and the DNA's candidate for Killarney in the recent general elections. Also noted businessman and principal of CFAL, Mr. Anthony Ferguson, as well as sociologist and columnist Joseph Gaskins Jr. Welcome and thanks for joining us. I'm going to call you Joey for the purpose of this show.
I appreciate that.
Welcome to the show, Arinthia. Welcome back to the show. It's
Thank
not
you
your
for
first
having
time
me.
with us.
Yes.
And Tony, certainly welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, folks, we're going to talk about, as we said in the beginning, the state of our economy. There's been a lot said, particularly since the elections and now with the budget debate currently going on. We've really heard a picture of gloom and doom in some aspects about where we are as a country economically and even our future within the next, I would say, even 12 to 24 months. I want to start, though, with the national debt. And have we really ever had a national debt, or has in context, have we had a debt bigger than this previously, and have we ever really found ourselves in a position that we are in right now? Anyone?
No, we have not. The debt in 2008 was about $4+ billion. Today, the debt is about $7+ billion on indirect debt. Our debt to GDP prior to 2008 was about 40%. Today, the current debt to GDP is about 79%. On the current trajectory, we're forecasting that the debt could reach 92% in the next year. And if we were to include, which no one talks about, the unfunded pension liability of this country, right now we're probably around 120% of debt to GDP. So to say we're in precarious financial times and position is an understatement. And I think the current budget does not have much opportunity to really move us out of this position, save for focusing almost entirely in trying to grow the economy and really cut back where there are, quite frankly, wastage. But the economy is in a very, very, very precarious position right now. And over the next 12 months, it'll be challenging.
When you say precarious, how dangerous, dangerously close to the edge are we? And really, or I guess, how close to the edge are we? And what is it going to take to bring us back from the brink?
I mean, we're very close. I mean, the reality is this. We implemented, prior to, well, first of all, revenue has been flat over the last 8 years. Tourism continued to be the driving force behind the economy. Overnight tourist arrival today is lower than it was 20 years ago. Revenues are declining, save for VAT, which was implemented 2-3 years ago. Even with the VAT now, after almost 2 years of full VAT, revenues are flat and declining. And our debt and our expenses continue to increase unabated. And so, for instance, today, the interest cost of our debt is about 15%. If you then forecast that what we need for both direct government and indirect, i.e. the government corporations, next year our debt service could run probably around 300 to 325 million. That's, you have to address that. Just think about it this way. As an individual, you don't manage your finances the way the country's finances are being managed. And hopefully the government had the new government had 10 days to look at this. So hopefully over the next 6 months, you would probably see them trying to make decisions that will mitigate some of the increase in debt and try to increase revenues.
Arinthia Kumanovic, you have been able to see and witness what measures the new government is putting in place or wants to put in place to try and, as Mr. Ferguson so eloquently laid out, bring us back from the brink. Are they, in your opinion, are those measures adequate to stabilize the economy or to bring us back or to get us to the point of a more robust economy?
I think in some cases when you look at the budget communication, there are certain points in there that are good, that we're looking forward. We're seeing this commitment to fiscal prudence and accountability, although we've heard this conversation before. We're also seeing a commitment to fiscal responsibility legislation. What we're not hearing is timelines as to where we're going to bring these particular policy initiatives into place. And these are the things that we have to have, because we're going to hear this pandering a lot as we continue to hear these administration in and administration out, but we need particular timelines. And to answer your question as to whether these initiatives are adequate, the reality is, as Mr. Ferguson said, no, we've not been here before. We've been on a slippery slope, and we've come from safe territory in 2008, as he mentioned, and we continue to run these huge deficit spending inside our government administrations. And what the current administration has to focus on right now is the same issue that the previous administration had to focus on, which is to get our fiscal house in order, focusing on debt reduction, focusing on sustaining the national debt reduction, and reducing the fiscal deficit. But what I don't see very clearly inside this budget communication is a commitment to economic growth. Because the only way that we can focus on reducing these deficits and reducing the debt is to, one, either increase taxes. We can't afford to do that in this particular economic climate, because the economic indicators show that it would perhaps cause an even greater shock to the economy if we were to just focus on these things. We have the issue where, as it relates to when we talk about the annual deficit, when the PLP government came to office in 2012, we had to borrow $550 million. They came back in the mid-year and borrowed $100 million, $650. By that end of that fiscal year, they had to borrow an additional $465 million. We're back in the same position again 5 years later. We had to borrow, the government is saying now they're going to borrow $722 million. We're hoping when they come back in the mid-year budget, they're not saying they're going to have to borrow more money. But we have to find a way to stop this bleeding. And we're not going to do that by increasing more taxes, because as Mr. Ferguson had indicated, we introduced value-added tax in the last administration. And despite the fact that revenue was increasing, although falling short in other areas, but nevertheless revenue was increasing, the expenditure continued to increase and the deficit continued to increase. And we've allowed administration after administration to continue this borrowing appetite. You know, we've become addicted now to borrowing. We have a spending habit. We have a tax spending and borrowing habit. And what is proving now that as we continue to move forward, we're seeing that we're not able to allocate enough funds now to social services, and we're now spending more monies on just servicing debt. And as he indicated, you see that the debt servicing cost is going to increase. And then we have these ticking time bombs like the $2.2 billion unfunded pension liability. We also have these contingent liabilities, which in a sense will soon fall due year in and year out. If you look at the Central Bank 2016-2017 report, they indicated that contingent liabilities contracted by $25 million. That may sound good, but at the same time, government expenditure expanded by $25 million because the government had to come to the rescue of public corporations like the Bahamas Development Bank, the Public Health Authority, and the Bahamas Electricity Corporation. And so when you're looking at this debt, you cannot just look at the direct charge. You also have to look at these contingent liabilities, because they are now starting to have a real impact on the government spending and the position that we find ourselves in now.
2 points that you all brought up that I want to come back to, but Joy, I want to get you in on this discussion. To Joe Public, who sits at home listening to this discussion, watching the budget debate, and hearing that the national debt has grown by so much, and despite the monies that were collected from VAT, which we were sold on would help to reduce the debt, we see the debt growing. What psychologically do you think that is doing to a lot of Bahamians who are witnessing all of this and thinking to myself, well, I'm working every day, I'm making money, prices are going up. What is sort of the state of our people when you look at this? Because as a Bahamian, I'm sitting listening to this and looking at other indicators and wondering what is going to be my fate in another few years.
Right, so it has to be difficult, and I think the ramifications of it you can see in the last election, and you will see continue to be exacerbated over the course of this term if there isn't a change in trajectory. I think one of the big issues that we're facing now is complete erosion in the trust of government as an institution, right? Because people have said certain things and certain things weren't done, and we look like we're going to have to pay for it in the long term, right? And I think that has been displayed in what we saw literally played out in the election, which has historically never been seen before in the political landscape of the Bahamas, right? People aiming directly at the government of the day and saying, listen, we don't trust you anymore, we'll take whatever we can get besides you, and we not necessarily even looking at policy, but needing to feel like there's somebody else who can do this because we no longer trust the institutions to operate on our behalf. This puts the new government in an interesting position, especially given the fiscal conditions that we're in. And eventually they're going to have to make a political choice, or they're going to have to make a choice based in reality. There are some essential services, things that everyday Bahamians rely on. And the current course that we're on, when the Minister of Finance made his presentation, I looked at my Facebook timeline, and there were a number of people shouting, austerity, austerity, right? And the average Bahamian doesn't know what that might mean, but that is a tightening of the belt. And usually what goes in austerity is things like social services, education, healthcare, things like that, while keeping the most essential services like police officers to protect property and persons. But even then, equipment for police officers, how they work, the resources that they have at their disposal begin to dissipate. And so I imagine that the average Bahamian is wondering, well, these things that I rely on from government and have relied on for so long, whether that's food stamps or just kind of general assistance, will they be free healthcare at the hospital? Will these things begin to disappear? Will the rug be pulled out from under our feet? And how do we begin, because I don't understand what's going on here, how do we begin to solve these problems? So I think those are two, from my perspective, primary concerns Bahamians have. One, are our institutions in fact working for our benefit? Can we trust them to do what they say that they're going to do? And second, what does this all mean for my reliance on the essential services in Bahamian society that my family depends on a day-to-day basis?
Most definitely. Folks, we're at the point of our first break in the show. We have a lot to discuss. Definitely some of the points that were raised here. Tonight we are discussing charting a new way forward, the realities of the Bahamian economy. We're going to take a quick break. We are back with more On the Record right after this.
This segment is sponsored by Percy's Island Game.
There is no better tradition than a father and son going fishing, and that's why the Island Game is giving away 5 Father's Day packages that include a half-day fishing trip for 4, a gourmet lunch to take along, and of course a cooler filled with your favorite beverages. Did we miss anything? How about some fine cigars and $300 cash to make it a Father's Day you won't forget? The Island Game is a Bahamian tradition just like father-son moments, so don't miss out this June and enter to win at the Island Game.
We playing with Island Games.
Down home. That's what I'm talking about. Gimme. Yes, sir. Give me that concertina, boy, come rake that song. Give me the music, take me back when I was born. It's the sweetest music. Yes, I'm an island gal for sure. Oh, yeah. Keep my heart jumping.
For news that's happening in our country, the best place to turn is Our News.
Good evening, Bahamas. Coming up tonight.
The biggest stories on the best station.
Helping news tonight. The government collected almost.
The Education Minister dismissed. The Bahamar Claims Committee explains how unsecured.
Giving you all sides of the equation to keep you informed.
Well, in other news, police are cracking down on
the claims of Bahamar's creditors and
police are on the scene here at a popular hangout.
Statement yesterday, Catholic Archbishop.
Watch Our News weeknights 7:30 and weekends at 7 p.m. only on RTV.
We are back with more On the Record tonight. Unemployment is at 12.9%. The new government has pledged to start projects to put a dent in this unemployment rate. We'll be looking at that and many other issues relative to the economy tonight. But folks, before we really get into that, there's some things that we spoke of in the first segment I want to go back to. One being whether we think the $720 million that is being borrowed to service the national debt will be adequate enough, and will it yield the results that the government is saying or hoping that it will yield?
I mean, the mistake you just made, though, you assume you can borrow 722.
Oh.
Right?
That's always a problem I have when I go to the bank. I always want more than what I can qualify for.
And the reality is, it's not going to be as easy as simply saying we're going to borrow 722 million, right? And so, yes, government can tax, and they can show that they have the capacity to pay if they continue to tax. But you can't tax your way out of a problem. And if you're going to do that, just go back to the revenue side for a second. We implemented VAT 2 years running, and revenue is still short. If you look at receipts in certain areas, the revenues are actually down, which tells you, like business license, etc., that the imposition of that tax has caused a number of businesses to go out of business. So,
out of business, or just people aren't paying other taxes?
No. A number of businesses have closed, right? And that's the one thing you need to be concerned about when you are imposing tax. There's sometimes these consequential actions results from these things. And you go ahead.
No, but Mr. Ferguson, I just wanted to make to play devil's advocate here, because the former government would argue that the reason why they haven't seen the return on VAT was because of 2 major hurricanes and the expenses that those caused. And I wonder if you could explain to the Bahamian people if how much of a factor that is, because as a person who's not an economist, as a sociologist, I kept hearing we would have been doing better were it not for these hurricanes. How does that play in?
I mean, that's been disingenuous. Because generally speaking, when there's a disaster like that, there's a lot of new money coming in to actually fix up the buildings, etc. So
this was just hurricane relief effort, and money's coming in.
Look, I mean, to cut it short, the economy was poorly, badly managed, worst ever. Just based on the numbers. We're not going to get emotional about these things, right? The reality is, right, hopefully one of the learning lessons from this is we will probably consider now setting up a catastrophic kind of national fund that people contribute so that government buildings, etc., that were damaged are not place a burden on the Bahamian people. Back to the 150, a lot of that had to do with, casual spending here. There was no accountability really in terms of, yes, we have to help our brothers and sisters who are less fortunate, but the cavalier manner in which we just go about, your house we're going to fix, your house we're going to fix, we're going to miss you here, we're going to do this. There are a number of things. But back to the point about the 722. I mean, the reality is there will come a time when the market will say no more. Right, so for instance, let's say we had to go to the US market, because we can't raise all of that in the local market. The numbers are just not there. Given where our rating is today, but more importantly, given the trajectory of where we're headed and given the lack of growth in our economy, just as an example, the last 4 years, we've borrowed over $2 billion, and the average growth was negative 0.5 over that time period, the average. So normally when you borrow money, you borrowed to grow something. So you borrowed money and the economy was still shrinking. So what it says, it was just pure, unadulterated wastage. That's it. And so going to the market is going to be challenging, particularly in the international market, where I think our cost of funding will increase from where it is today. And in some instances, it's going to be challenging to actually borrow money, because what we fail or forget, most pension funds, insurance companies, or long-term investors, their investment policy statement said you only could invest in investment grade. So when you go below investment grade, even if I held your paper, I have to try sell it. I'm certainly not going to buy more. And so these are some of the hard facts. I don't envy the position that the new Minister of Finance finds himself today. He's going to have to do a lot of heroic hoop jumping to really, for the next 18 months, try to stabilize things and then try to grow the economy. And he's going to have to cut wastage. And quite frankly, if we can do that, we may be in a position to get it. But I'm hopeful.
Joe, you mentioned something about austerity and whether we are prepared to do what it takes as a country to tighten our belts and to stop the wastage of which Mr. Ferguson speaks, and is even coming out almost daily in the budget debate. I mean, every day you pick up the newspapers or watch the news, there's some other allegation of X amount of million being wasted here or money's going here that didn't seem to make any fiscal or economic sense. But are we prepared as a people to do what it takes now to get the economy back on track when we say, hey, the free lunch over here is about to come to an end?
Right. I'm not sure. I think for a very long time, and the panel can disagree with me on this, but I think for a very long time, Bahamians expected quite a bit from their government.
Continue to expect.
And continue to expect a lot from their government, while giving to their government as little as possible. I mean, even the one of the taxes that we had, like customs duties. That's something that you pay coming into the country. We all know ways to avoid paying customs duties, don't we? You put your things in the dirty clothes. You put it under the luggage lining.
Say how much you spent, yeah.
Right. And so, what Bahamians have to be prepared for is to either expect less from government or give more to government, or both at the same time. There is ways, I think, that we can move the population toward understanding that. I think if the government is transparent and communicates clearly to the Bahamian people that we have a set of financial or fiscal goals ahead of us, and this is what we need to do to get there, and we need everybody on board, I think the Bahamian people would be more willing to take part in that. But you have to be brought into the tent on this. This cannot be done from on high. I think a lot of people felt like VAT was implemented that way, even though the government did have classes and informational sessions and things like that. But I don't think people understood what made value-added tax necessary. And then on the flip side of that, what value-added tax would they believe VAT was going to be used for, they felt it wasn't used for that. And so those are the transparency and accountability, communicating and including the Bahamian people in a process of either increasing taxes or cutting back on services or doing both simultaneously. That is the only way. Otherwise, I think Bahamians, you'll find yourselves at the side that Bahamians were on before the election. Very quickly, the honeymoon will be over.
Yeah, I think you spoke to it most eloquently when you spoke about the trust deficit that people
exactly.
have. Arinti, I want to shift the discussion a little bit. Unemployment in New Providence, 2.9%. Grand Bahama and Abaco, 13.3%. What does this new government need to do now to stimulate the economy, improve those employment figures, get Bahamians working again, and get money or more money into the pockets of our people?
Yes. I think when you speak about unemployment, we know that we've been in double-digit unemployment now for several years, and so it's a structural issue. And you asked this very important question, Jerome, is the 722 sufficient? And the question is not necessarily whether the 722 is sufficient, and as Mr. Ferguson spoke to, can we borrow it? But rather, is the 722 sufficient to carry out the plans of the current government? And what are the plans of the current government? How do they expect to grow this economy? Because what we have been focusing on, like I said, from administration to administration, is this debt, focusing on the debt and deficit reduction, but there's no true focus or emphasis on growth.
Which is the other part.
Which is the other issue. Mm-hmm. And as was rightly said, fiscal policy is not going to get us out of the situation. Bahama is not the panacea for our growth issues as well. The IMF has already indicated that if we are going to absorb the 5,000 entrants into the job market on an annual basis, we have to grow by at least 4%. If we're going to slash this unemployment rate in half, we need 5.5% growth. And these are the things that we are not seeing coming out of this budget communication. I want to see what is the government going to move forward in its plans in terms of growing the two main contributors to our gross domestic product. We have the tourism sector and we have the financial services sector. And we know some of the issues, there's certain key issues that are impacting all of those industries. And one of them is this whole issue of energy. And you spoke about how we're going to get more funds back into the hands of the Bahamian people and how we're going to get more disposable income to be able to circulate inside the economy. And we spoke about this fall off in business license fees, which Central Bank said was some 25%. And when you think about that, there's several things going on in there. It's either, as Mr. Ferguson said, businesses are closing because of the entrance of these new taxes that are coming in, or either it's the case that businesses are operating, as you suggested, but not paying their fees, which speaks to another issue. Perhaps our revenue mechanism, the way we're capturing revenue, is not strong enough, or perhaps businesses are not profitable. And we can't even say that just based on business license fees, because we have this issue where businesses are taxed on turnover and not necessarily profitability. So there are several things going on in there. And if you have that engine of that aspect of your economy under attack, in addition to the other monetary side of things where we have this high liquidity inside the Bahamian market. And in such a time where you have high liquidity, business owners should be able to access capital, but it's difficult for them to access capital because of not only do we have a national debt crisis, we have an individual debt crisis. You know, so if we're going to talk about addressing the structural unemployment issue, we have to have a true conversation on growth. And so these are the things I want to hear the Minister of Finance talking about, whether he has to set up a joint select committee between both parties and both houses of parliament to give us a very clear and articulate plan, strategic and technical plan, as to how we're going to reduce this deficit and how we're going to reduce this debt, because we continue to run these sensational ads inside the newspapers and sensational talk shows and say, wow, we're borrowing 500 million, wow, we're borrowing 722 million, and we do not hold these administrations' feet to the fire to justify this borrowing. What are you going to give us? What is the trade-off? How are you going to grow the economy? Where are you going to slim the fat? Where is there going to be the public sector reform? Where is there going to be true reform on energy, which is impacting the small business sector?
We're going to a break, but I've got to get this question in. Really, does a portion of the answer lie with the growth of entrepreneurs, small business, medium-sized businesses? That we're talking about business, the fact that we've lost business license fees because, as you suggest, businesses are closing. Is that really where some more focus should be given? As a small business owner myself, I know that the requirements are erroneous in operating a business. Sometimes just in getting a business license, it's a challenging process. But is that where the answer, in some measure, lies?
You have to remember that, you know, over the last few years, we've slid in our ranking in the ease of doing business from 106th place to 121. And while other nations in the region that look like us have been improving on this. If you speak to folks in Grand Bahama, the new Grand Bahama Investment Incentives Act seems to have proliferated the red tape around government. You now have to go to Nassau to know whether or not you get, you know. So I think yes, as a former small business owner, the red tape, the bureaucracy, and the expense of running business, in particular, energy expenses, like for me owning a restaurant, my refrigeration, the lights, et cetera, those things become unsustainable. And so the environment itself does not foster business growth or entrepreneurial growth in the country.
One quick thing before we go to the break. Let's remind ourselves, however, that it's not the role of the government to grow the economy.
Right.
I would prefer to see them get out of business. All of these quasi-government corporations that are poorly managed, poorly run, that is contributing to the annual debt of the tune between 50 to 100 plus million a year. If they just stop that, I think we'll be very, very okay. And when we come up, we can talk about it, but the single biggest engine or opportunity for growth in this country, as everyone said, is energy reform, and that has to be done expeditiously and not delayed for another several years, because the impact of it is anywhere from 1% to 2% growth in GDP. But that's the single biggest thing.
We are way over our time. We are going to take our next break in the show. My guests are Cynthia Kumalafe, Anthony Ferguson, and Joey Gassings Jr. We are discussing charting a new way forward, the realities of the Bahamian economy. We are back right after this break.
Hey beautiful, let Amani Hair put you in the spotlight with our fabulous hair and hair care products. Longing for length? Try our wide selection of Remy and Virgin hair. Keep it natural with hair care lines like Carol's Daughter, Ali K Naturals, As I Am, and many more. Be radiant with our wide selection of skincare products. Have questions? Connect with Amani Hair on Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. Located Soldier Road and Shakur Way. Telephone 698-1155 or 422-1191. Let Amani Hair make a Barbie out of you.
faster internet speeds for free when you get TV, internet, and phone. Ask for Trio from Rev.
Join the revolution.
This is us. We all live here. And while we don't think of ourselves as numbers, in the grand scheme of things, numbers are part of who we are. Like your phone number, for instance. That's why at Alive we believe you should keep your number when you switch. Go in store today and ask an Alive Switch Angel. They'll make it real simple for you. We are alive.
Welcome back to the second half of tonight's episode of On the Record. We are discussing charting a new way forward, the realities of the Bahamian economy. My guests this evening are Cynthia Kumalafe, Anthony Ferguson, and Joey Gaskins. Back to our discussion. Tony, as we went to the break, you talked about energy reform and why that was so necessary and needed, something that springboarded off of Joey's comments as a former small business owner and the impact that has and continues to have on the business community, whether you're small or large.
Well, I mean, again, from our perspective, energy reform is the most critical. Yes, crime is a major problem, but energy reform from an economic generation jumpstart must get done within the next 6 months, or it will only further delay the challenges that we face. And as I said earlier, the additional revenues generated, we worked out an estimate between 1% to 2% of GDP. So in 1 year, where in the last 4 years, you have to preface it, the last 4 years, we had negative 0.5% of GDP on average. Just with energy reform, we believe that in the next year, we can see a growth in GDP of between 1% to 2%. So that's significant. And that's just one item on the list. The second one, I think, will be immigration reforms. Major, right? Given all of the, Ms. Kumalafe spoke about the two engines, tourism and financial services. So financial services 10 years ago contributed around 20 to 25% if you talk about indirect contribution to GDP. Today it's probably around 10 to 15%. And part of it has been the decline, or the whole regulatory regime change globally. Again, we believe that immigration reform can certainly cause us to increase the financial services sector and by extension the manufacturing and other business sector. And by that I mean we need to make it easier for persons with wealth. I'm not talking about, if you will, the migrant immigration, but if you look in the US, Canada, the UK, all of these countries open their arms to bring in persons with substantial wealth, business acumen, and assimilate them in the communities. We tend to do the opposite. And we have a significant opportunity to keep the resources here in the banking sector if those persons are able to let's spend a little time with the assets here. And I think, and I hope that the government will look at some of these initiatives sooner rather than later that will at least, let's say, mitigate, alleviate the downtrend we're in now and move forward. And because you have to recall, of the budget, 70% goes towards salaries and rents, etc. You can't do anything about that. 15.9% is going to go to servicing the debt, right? So you really have less than 15% to try growing economies. It's not doable. And so you have to be very, very strategic in executing what I will call the larger plans to move the economy or get the economy going.
I'd like to jump back to a point that Mr. Ferguson said, and we have been talking about crime quite a bit as the number one issue the country is facing. But I think it's important for people to also understand that if we are going to solve the crime problem, we have to grow the economy.
Right.
Sociologically, we know that the main driver of crime is our failing economy. And as far as people actually committing crimes, the research shows that there are two drivers of crime, either absolute poverty, in other words, people can't afford to put food on the table, or relative poverty. In other words, people are looking at wealthy people around them and not understanding why they don't have the same opportunities or opportunities in the country that they live in. And so solving the economy, we can lock people up as much as we want to, we can give the police more guns, we can create more police officers and put them on the streets. But the fundamental driver of crime is of our failing economy. And until we solve that problem, we will always have a crime problem. Crime is a symptom. It is not the actual fundamental problem here.
So you see, I definitely that the two are intertwined. I want to go back, though, to something that we started talking about very early on in the show, this issue of the pension liability and the contingent liability. And I think Mr. Ferguson brought a portion of it up when he talked about those quasi-government institutions that continue to drain the public purse. But I want to talk about those things and how we begin now to dig ourselves out of the hole that these issues that these two areas have created.
Yes. Well, see, I think we need to take a more comprehensive approach to how we're governing. You know, what we have had is administrations just holding the fort. And I spoke about this on multiple occasions where fiscal policy alone is not going to do it. We need a combination of the monetary policy, the economic policy reform, as well as public sector reform. It is key, and a part of that, a key major part of that public sector reform is that $2.2 billion unfunded pension liability, which is a ticking bomb. And there are several things that we're going to have to factor in there.
If you could sort of explain, folks, what that pension liability, where that comes from, so that some folks understand.
Well, basically, it's just a shortfall in having to be able to meet the obligations of the National Insurance Board and the pension requirements there. So there are several things that we may have to look at. We may actually have to look at cutting entitlements, or we may have to look at increasing contributions, or both. Or simply we may have to look at other aspects in terms of increasing the retirement age for persons. And these are all considerations that administration after administration, we talk about it all the time, that they continue to kick this can down the road. Yeah. And it's an issue that we're not addressing. And you also talk about the state-owned enterprises, whereas in the communication, the Minister of Finance had indicated that in excess of $400 million has been committed for 25 state-owned enterprises, which is an increase of approximately $80 million. And owing to that, in a large part, is the introduction of national health insurance. And while we need social initiatives and we have certain obligations that we have to be able to deliver on behalf of the Bahamian people, we also have to look at sustainable ways of how we're introducing these initiatives. When I think about the introduction of national health insurance, for example, we're talking about a direct $40 million in the budget that's allocated just to the NHIA, which is the National Health Insurance Authority, which is another layer of bureaucracy. This on top of the chief medical officer already saying to us that we have in excess of $100 million that we're losing annually. And so what we're doing is, and you talked earlier about this spending from the previous administration, how is it that the revenue was increasing but the expenditure was, but the revenue was increasing but we weren't seeing the gains? That's because expenditure was increasing. And we introduced agencies like the BAMSI, we introduced NHI, we introduced a National Training Agency, and so we continue the spending, and we're adding, in some instances, levels of bureaucracy on top of levels of bureaucracy, and we're not moving forward to, as Mr. Ferguson alluded to earlier, getting government out of certain types of businesses. Why are we carrying these state-owned enterprises? The minister, in his contribution, spoke to the fact that they will look to see if they could make these institutions viable. Well, good luck on that. We've been trying to do that now.
We've been down this road quite a few times.
We've been on this path before we've heard the story.
You look at a lot of those institutions, and to be quite honest, in my own experience and in other places, they are a dumping ground for political favors. People need a job. You send them to one of these institutions. They're unqualified, unwilling to work, not quite sure what they're doing, and continue to. So they have to be employed. They're collecting.
And this is why we talk about
insurance,
public sector reform. And as Mr. Ferguson said, no, it is not the government's role to grow to basically grow the economy, but they have to put the environment in place. And if we have an environment that is conducive to the private sector thriving, we will start to see attrition from the public sector. And we will see persons leaving the public sector and going into the private sector.
One thing I want to throw out there, are there enough contained in government, are there enough technocrats who can speak to these issues, who can advise government on the way forward, what we should be doing? Because I'm listening to this, and in private business and in any business, there's that thing called return on investment. We're putting money in and we're expecting a return, but it doesn't seem like that is the modus operandi of government. We just throw money in to these institutions and corporations and don't expect anything in return.
But I think the whole paradigm with respect to how we negotiate terms of references with investors coming, etc., I think has been flawed. You know, when they say a rising tide lifts all boats, the reality is, 40 years ago when all economies were growing, it's easy to just give things away without regard for return on investment. So, for instance, we like to focus on the hotel industry, we give these lands, but no one is, as you said, what am I giving up and what am I getting back? That doesn't appear, because we only can sit from the outside and look in, to be the bottom line or the baseline for negotiation. But I'd like to go back to the pension for 1 second, right? The unfunded pension liability of $2.8, that has nothing to do with national insurance. That is just the civil servants. When we take into account national insurance, by 2029, if, as Ms. Komalafi indicated, we don't cut back on entitlements, increase contributions, or extend the retirement age, technically speaking, right, national insurance would be in a position that, as they say in financial terms, insolvent, inability to pay. That's never going to happen, because all the government is going to do is they're going to tax us more to contribute, right?
And go ahead.
So then, the question is, though, right? There have been any number of recommendations made since 1994 that I would have been a party to defer these things. But as is always the case, if it's free, probably it's not accepted. But, I think, you talk about the technocrats, the government need to tap into the young talent. We have some really bright young people in this country who have been very exposed, who would help gratis, without pay. They gratuitously, they would offer their opinion, their expertise, and to move the country forward. Because when the country moves forward, we all move forward. If it doesn't move forward, we're all going to have a problem.
I know you've got a point. I just want you to hold that. We're going to take our final break. We're talking about charting the new way forward, the realities of the Bahamian economy. Our final break. We're going to continue the discussion right after this.
Caller ID, call forwarding, call waiting, and call blocking.
I think it's time you cut the blue wire.
Cut the blue wire. Save up to $250 on your phone features with RevVoice. Get RevVoice. Save money.
We are now in a new political era, a new prime minister, government, and opposition. What are the new challenges, and what role will the Bahamian people play in this new era of governance? Join me, your host Jerome Sawyer, each week for On the Record as we examine the latest political news and views. That's On the Record, airing every Thursday at 8 p.m. on cable channel 212. See you then.
You can take the very best in entertainment with you with Cinemax Go. Log in to CinemaxGoLA.com and enjoy more than 300 hours of programming, blockbuster movies, and exclusive series at your pace, as many times as you want. And for free, enjoy Cinemax with your subscription television package. Wow. Cinemax Go. Cinema to go.
Rev, join the revolution.
We are are back with our final segment of tonight's On the Record. Our esteemed panel in the heat of a discussion now, really about what it's going to take to really turn our economy around and chart us on a new course. As we went into the break, really in that discussion about what is to become really of the pension liability going forward. How do we fix? How do we reform? Joey, I know you had some comments you wanted to.
Well, yes, and I think this is a point, especially for people my age and younger. We know that the largest voting bloc in the last election were people between the ages of 18 and 35. It's a young population. All of this spending now, and I think people my age and younger need to understand what this means for us in the future, right? So all this spending that's happening now will not get solved now. And as Mr. Ferguson said during the break or before, we cannot rely on national insurance when it comes time for us to claim our entitlements when we are 60, 65, or whatever the age is. The burden of debt will eventually be shifted to us. We will have to pay the debt, and whether that is through increased value-added tax, through some new form of taxation, through austerity that takes away the services that our parents had, that we will not have in the future. In each instance, the spending that is happening now, we will have to take care of in the future. And so it behooves all of us to be really involved in this process, to be really observant about what's happening. We need to go through the budget debate. We need to hold our representatives accountable. And when necessary, we need to use our power as a voting bloc to change the way that things are working. And so it's really important for young people to be involved in this process.
Do you think this election, though, has changed in any way the psyche of the electorate? Do they feel more empowered to change what they don't like? And I'm sorry, it's you smiling. I'm going to start with you. To have such a devastating defeat for a sitting government, for a sitting prime minister to lose his seat, for that message to be sent, do voters feel empowered to send that message that we want change?
I'm not entirely sure, but what I do know is that the Bahamian people do exercise that right every 5 years. And it's good in the spirit of democracy, but as we can see, it obviously has a negative impact on economic growth. We've not been able to have a consecutive government since the 1992 government of Hubert Ingraham, which was re-elected again in 1997. And we've been back and forth with this pendulum shifting 2007, 2012, 2017. And if we go by that trend, it is likely that we can be back here again in 2022. Although I'm hoping that we're not back at that trend. I'm really hoping that this administration puts us in a position not where we're going to become like some of our regional counterparts, where we're in a compulsory state, and then austerity will become a word that Bahamian people know. And then we're not going to have any control over how we're going to grow this economy, how we're going to cut our expenditure or even utilize our expenditure. And so these things here, they need to stop being words now. We need to get out of the political climate now. We need to get out of campaign mode and election mode, and we need to get into the spirit of governance now.
But I also think there was a movement over the course of the election for people who felt like they had no good choice among parties to destroy their ballots, right? There is an ideological argument for that can be made. I don't think the problem of Bahamian democracy, though, and the involvement of the Bahamian populace requires us to retreat from democratic participation. It does not require us, I don't think it requires us to use the instruments of democratic participation that we have to make protests. We have to first ask ourselves, how involved have Bahamians been in the democratic process to begin with? You cannot get upset that you have only choices that you don't like if you don't participate at the offset of democracy, in the parties, in communities, et cetera, et cetera. And so if Bahamians are actually really tired of what's going on here, this new government has promised constituency meetings. I know Ellsworth Johnson announced, the Minister of State for Legal Affairs announced yesterday that he will be having community meetings in the community of Yamacraw and the constituency of Yamacraw. You need to find yourselves out there. You need to find ways to more deeply engage in your democracy if we're going to solve these problems. For me, this is not the time to withdraw. And that is a question that the Bahamian people themselves have to answer. No politician can solve that. There's no political party can solve that. We have to decide as a people how we will engage with our democracy. And it starts with each and every one of us.
Good point. I want, though, to really play devil's advocate for a moment. A lot of what the government is laid out in this budget communication and in its plans for the budget really have to do with if everything goes according to plan. As we know, there are some external things that can happen that can really derail this process. If we are hit with a hurricane or a series of hurricanes, if let's say the United States goes to war, that could be a very likely. If there is some major terrorist act of a 9/11, that can really call an external occurrence can really derail all plans and all good intentions. Are we in a position, or have you seen anything that can speak to us recovering from that, or even trying to sustain what we have?
I mean, there's a saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? But I'm going to be a little bit more upbeat, right? In spite of the numbers that are before us. I agree with you that the electorate is just intolerant of being disrespected, abused, and just taken advantage of. I think those days are over with. So the current administration have made certain promises and what I would call policy promises, i.e. fiscal reform, 2 terms, etc. Things, those I call high-level policy. If those things are implemented sooner rather than later, I think from an electorate standpoint, it would indicate that, okay, these gentlemen are at least respectful of what they promise us. From an international perspective, the rating agencies, if we have transparency, would be in a position to say, okay, yes, they make these promises. No, all plans do have issues that may arise, but if you have a plan and you're executing it, I think the rating agency will be less, will be more tolerant in terms of delaying, let's say, further downgrade, etc. But the government has to demonstrate, or the administration has to demonstrate that they mean what they say and they say what they mean.
I think from a sociological standpoint, and as a person who's worked in politics, executing the policy and doing that well is important, but also I think one of the weaknesses of the last government was its communication with people as well. And this government will need a strong communications apparatus to keep the Bahamian people informed, one, but also they will need to build what we call architectures of listening that will allow them to constantly listen to the people of the Bahamas and to engage that information that they are gathering from people in their policy making. You can pass the laws you need to, you can do all the things that you've promised, but if people don't know you're doing it, if there's not a consistent message around that, and if you're not also listening to your populace through the 5 years, not just when you start knocking on doors before the election, then we may see a shift in the way that the Bahamian people are oriented towards their government. Without that, I think we're in hot water.
There is a saying sometimes that what is the right thing to do is not always the popular thing to do.
That's correct.
And a lot of times governments find themselves in that precarious position and will lean towards what is popular as opposed to what is right.
That happens with career politicians.
I think we have to get to that point where our politicians are saying, if I'm serving for 1 term, I'm making an impact. If you're not going to re-elect me in 2022, then that's fine. We would have done so much work that whoever comes behind us cannot turn it back. So much positive work. And that's why we talk about building these politicians that are not just looking to the next general election, but looking to the generation. Because you spoke about your generation having to pick up this bag. You know, it's not just with pension, but it's also with the debt itself.
So many other things.
And social issues.
We're going to the back end of the show, so I'm going to sort of let us use this time for closing comments, and I'll start with you, Joey. But really, what are you hoping to see that will bring that turnaround and change from an economic perspective? Because obviously the economy changes everything. We spoke to crime, we spoke work, all these other things. But what are you looking to see or hoping to see over the next 6, 9, 12 months that will show to you some positive changes or some positive measures towards change?
So for me, it's still early. But what I think we're all looking for is a clear vision, right? That clear vision has to have attached to it timelines, key performance indicators, targets, things that we can watch.
That are a part of regular business.
That are a part of policy making and policy implementation. And on top of that, I keep my point. It is weak to just go with the popular thing when you know that there's something that you need to do. As people in politics, it is our job to persuade. If people don't like what you're about to do, but you know it is the right thing, put a strong case out there. And so the second thing I want to see is a cohesive and comprehensive communications effort by this government that not only pushes information out to the Bahamian public, but also builds architectures of listening so they are constantly hearing what the Bahamian people are saying about their policies.
That's most important. Ferguson?
Well, I mean, you know, just looking at the minister's bullet points, right? And I've kind of reorganized them a bit, right? For me, the transparency and accountability has to be the number one thing. The prudent management of our dollars, or our tax collection, for me was number 2. Bahamian ownership opportunities, because we could only grow. We have to stop relying on foreign direct investments, and we have to start growing from within. And the business and regulatory environment that promotes entrepreneurship, those things are extremely important. If they get those things right, in addition to the communication policy, as you know, Gaston spoke about, I think for the next, and holding the line on their spending and cutting back some of those things that were just wasteful spending, I think we will at least hold the line and begin to put in place the foundation to grow the economy, in addition to some of the other things we discussed.
You'll get the last word.
Yes, I endorse the comments both of Joey and Mr. Ferguson, and I think I would only add to that. I would really like to see the government follow through with its good governance platform that it outlined in the speech to the throne. I would like to see them go further with the Whistleblowers Act and other legislation. Again, piggybacking on what Joey said, I would like to see timelines. We need SMART goals. We need to know when you're going to do these things, how you're going to do them, and how you're going to pay for them. So with that, I would like to see a strategic plan for debt reduction and deficit reduction. And more importantly, I want to see a key growth strategy in those 3 main areas that impact, or the 2 main areas that impact our gross domestic product, tourism and financial services. But speaking about the energy reform, I would also like to see us growing our contribution in the productive sectors.
Well, folks, thank you very much. I do want to say this has been quite an enlightening discussion. We have been able to articulate some great views. I trust that the politicians and policymakers have tuned in, or will tune in, or some will tell them to tune in at some point to listen, because I think some great information was shared here tonight. Thank you so very much for being a part of this great discussion. We always appreciate our guests, but certainly tonight was an eye-opener in many ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and we hope that you have enjoyed our show tonight. Special thanks to Arinthia Kumalafe, Joey Gaskins Jr., Anthony Ferguson, my producer, technical staff, and of course you, the audience, for watching us. Join us for more On the Record next week, same time, same place. Once again, I'm Jerome Sawyer, your host. We'll see you next time.